Hi, welcome to today's chat. I'm Gail and I'm on the Understood team. Today we're going to be talking about what goes on in the evaluation process. Our guest is Dr. Matthew Cruger. He's a clinical psychologist and senior director of the Learning and Development Center at Child Mind Institute. Hi, Matt. How are you?
I'm great. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for coming. Do you want to take a few minutes to introduce yourself to everybody?
Oh, sure. As I mentioned, I work at the Child Mind Institute. I'm by training a neuropsychologist and really with a focus on pediatric neuropsychology. I've been working in the field for about 15 years now, and largely my work involves evaluations of learning disabilities, autism, language disorders, ADHD, and I mostly use tests and measurements as part of my evaluation to come up with diagnoses. I guess I would just also add that in the work that I do, I care a lot about making a good diagnosis when I see a child who has a diagnosis, but also trying to come up with a good game plan of how to help improve those outcomes for a child so that they're not suffering so much, and so that we can sort of take away the burdens related to a diagnosis as much as possible. And often that involves partnering with parents and schools to provide the right kind of care for a child.
Terrific. Before we start, I just want to let everybody know that we have a fabulous video of Dr. Cruger conducting an evaluation for reading issues, and you can see it at u.org/dyslexia evaluation. Also, everybody, just a reminder that you can ask questions in the chat box, and Dr. Cruger will try to answer all of them. Okay, time to jump in. I'm going to start sort of with the basic question, which is, what does an evaluation for learning disabilities involve, and what kind of professional does them?
Right. I guess the first thing that I should mention, the learning disability evaluation certainly has to involve a child or a teenager. That they're really, in a way, the most important person in the evaluation process. And they're typically referred because their parents or the child themselves or the teacher have concerns that the student's not performing at a level that they think they ought to be performing. That really serves, I think, as the background or basis for doing an evaluation when there are concerns being raised about learning potential or capacity. The people who do the evaluations can vary. In some settings, it's a person who has specialized training in doing educational parts of an evaluation. They might be a learning specialist or an educational therapist. They might include a speech and language therapist as well. But certainly, often a psychologist is involved in doing the evaluation. And that's because we add components to the evaluative process that include measuring intellectual capacity and thinking carefully about emotional difficulties that might also interfere with classroom adjustment. One of the main features of an evaluation is not only gathering data from a family about what is the process that they have seen unfold in their child's adjustment to school, how well are they doing, and where are they seeming to have some struggles, but also gathering information from seeing the child in the classroom and knowing that the child actually is struggling in some way with the demands and management of classroom expectations. And then we use standardized tests and measures to evaluate how a child's performing in areas of reading capacity, of written work, and in terms of mathematics, skill sets and capacity.
Great. A very basic question is, how long does an evaluation last? How long does it take? And does it happen in one sitting or over multiple sittings?
Right. As I mentioned, that typically evaluations are going to happen in more than one sitting. That's because we do want to do an interview with the family that doesn't necessarily include the child in that interview, but we have to gather that important sort of background information in order to really understand what's been seen and to get a handle on early developmental issues and things that have happened over the child's lifespan. So that meeting typically is separate, and the child's not necessarily a part of that meeting. But the actual testing experience, depending on what setting a person is in and how thorough the evaluation is or needs to be, the time frame could vary. Sometimes we might be able to do an evaluation that includes intellectual functioning, academic functioning, and some aspects of emotional functioning. And probably in about 3 hours, we would have a really good handle on how a student is performing. Other evaluations can take more time. So if we have concerns about speech and language and we want to do special additional tests to look at those skill sets, or if we do neuropsychological evaluations like the ones that I complete, sometimes we're spending much more time, like 6 hours to even 9 hours.
And I assume those are broken up. So maybe a student would do 3 hours at a time over 3 sessions, or
yes.
Okay.
Yeah, this is a very important question because some evaluators, to make their work experience a little bit more manageable, sometimes we'll see a child for a longer stretch of time. I tend to think that most kids who are 6 years and older could be able to sit for the process of an evaluation for about 3 hours with a good break in the middle. It's important that the evaluator is pacing the child's capacity to keep up with that. Because if they fatigue too early, we want to get good results. So if they fatigue too early, we're actually not necessarily measuring their capacity. We're measuring their abilities in the context of being fatigued or worn out or tired. So some children under 6 probably perform better in 2-hour spurts of time, and some children can't manage it for that long. Teenagers can sometimes perform for a longer period of time, so it's not unusual to schedule 4 hours of time with them or 5 hours. But we should know teenagers do better in the afternoon, children and adults, but children certainly do better in the morning. So if we're trying to think about all the factors that go into when you schedule an evaluation, scheduling at night after the child's had a long day of school, scheduling when they're sick or tired, these are things that we would try to eliminate because they're going to add error to the evaluation process. A child could start an evaluation maybe at 9 o'clock and work very effectively for an hour and a half, take a little break, work for, again, like another hour, and we could get a lot of good, valuable results from them in that time frame. But scheduling things after school and after school hours in times when there's a lot of a child's under a lot of stress or pressure because of their calendar, their schedule, those are things to try to avoid.
Right. I think when a lot of parents hear that their kid's going to be sitting for hours on end taking tests, that it's just going to be brutal. But correct me if I'm wrong, but I think a lot of kids find the tests to be fun.
It's almost universally my experience that the children who I evaluate get something enjoyable out of the experience. I try to add to that by being friendly and personable to show that I'm interested in them. I spend a little bit of time before we actually start the testing to talk to them so that I can make sure that they're feeling comfortable with me, not to just dive right into the tests. And I do want to tell them, answer questions that they might have about why I'm doing what I'm doing, because they deserve to know. And often a very brief response will be helpful for them. It's slightly unfair for me to say that every child who comes to do an evaluation with me enjoys the process. They are doing tests, and I agree most parents are concerned about the duration of the time that I'm seeing them. But all of the tests that I give tend to be very short, brief tests. They might last anywhere from a couple minutes to 15 minutes. And so I tell the child, I'm going to have you do a lot of tests. Some of them are interesting. Some of them are very familiar to you, like school-based work. And some of them are actually not very interesting and sort of boring. But they're all short. So if you don't like a test, it'll be over very quickly. That way I can keep them engaged by changing the test that I give them so that if they do something that is not very appealing to them, I switch and do something that is more interesting. The tests have been designed to be stimulating And so it's true that kids look at the test materials and they sometimes find them very interesting because the material is compelling. And I haven't really met a child who I did not think likes to think. Kids like to use their brains to solve problems and to handle challenges and to approach tasks, and they like to show that they're learning. That is what kids like to do. It's meaningful when a child is not excited or interested in learning. That's particularly a bad sign, or a sign that something is wrong. But that's one of the reasons why kids enjoy the work, because there's interesting stimuli that they can apply their minds to think about. They don't get feedback immediately about their results on several of the tests that I give. So many children recognize that when they're doing a task, they probably think they're doing pretty well on a task. And most kids actually do. The kids who struggle with any of the academic tasks I give them, or let's say if they have problems with language or looking at visual spatial information, when they confront one of those tests, they do often feel demoralized. It's hard to look at reading material when you already believe as a young child that you're not performing as well as your friends, and then it's hard to do a test of that. And kids definitely know when they're doing the test with me that I'm looking at how well they're doing. They know it because it's happening every day, and they're comparing themselves to other kids in their class. So they do get demoralized when that happens. And as an evaluator, we have to try to help them calm down, soothe them, give them some positive feedback. Sometimes we have to tell them quite honestly, yes, that was hard for you, but I'm going to try to figure out how to make it be easier for you. And those things can help a child leave an evaluation feeling much better. They do require a thoughtful application of what we're doing, a thoughtful application of the testing process, because the evaluator has to understand how the child might be feeling so that we can sort of take care of them. One thing that happens fairly regularly for me is that a child might do 3 hours of tests, and then by the time they're done with that, they're tired, that they really have been applying a lot of thought and effort to tasks for 3 hours. And while it happens that school is fast-paced and there's a lot of things being put before them, there's fewer moments of downtime or breaks that happen in the evaluation process, and so they can be worn down.
We have a parent asking a really common question. She has a child who was tested for learning issues and was diagnosed having slow processing speed. But the school thought that she should go get a clinical evaluation for ADHD at the pediatrician. So can you explain a little bit about the difference between testing for learning issues and assessing for ADHD?
Sure, it's a great question. So I will say, as an aside, we see individuals whose speed varies. So some kids are slow and some kids are quicker in their speed of executing a wide variety of tasks. And we don't necessarily think that that's an indication of a condition, that they may just be at a slightly slower tempo in how they approach things. That's slightly, there might be more nuance to that, but in and of itself, being slightly slower than your best friend is not an indication that you have a disability. It could get in your way if you're being expected often to do tasks that require fast work. But when I'm doing a learning disabilities evaluation, I certainly want to give an IQ test. I want to use that as sort of my standard for thinking about how a child is going to perform in other areas. So if a child has an average intellectual capacity, I suspect that they should be able to learn academic material just the way that other kids do, because they have sort of all the potential to do it. But when I look at learning, there's many different kinds of learning, but the kinds we look at when we think about learning disability diagnoses tend to be specifically looking at reading capacity, writing capacity, and mathematics. We're not really studying scientific learning, though we might look at intellectual capacities or other cognitive abilities that are tied to scientific learning. That tends not to be the main focus. The vast majority of students I see when we're evaluating for learning disabilities struggle with reading. There's no automatic capacity for the brain to learn to read. We're all primed to look at people and make sense of who they are. We're all primed to hear words and to pick up on language use, but we're not really from birth ready to read. We have to be taught how to read, and most of the kids struggle with that capacity. I tend to want to do tests that look at mechanical skills, academic skills, and also applied academic skills. So the mechanical skills for reading are being able to recognize words by sight, being able to sound out words that are unfamiliar to you, being able to read words in sentences, and then being able to derive meaning from what you've read. That's the process of developing from reading, decoding, fluency, and eventually comprehension, really understanding them. So comprehension and reading comprehension is the applied process that I want to look at. Decoding and fluency are sort of the mechanical skills that are involved in that. So I ask kids to look at common words, or I ask kids to look at nonsense words and decode them, or unfamiliar words. And then I test how quickly they can read, and I look at how well they understand passages that they read. So if I ask them to read sentences or longer passages and tell me about what they read, and I ask them questions that require them to show their understanding. I sort of apply the same process for writing. I want to see how kids' handwriting develops. I want to see how well they spell. And then I want to see how well they can write sentences and eventually paragraphs or short essays. And with mathematics, I want to look at their basic math fact knowledge and how quickly they can apply math facts. I want to see what computation skills they have, like solving paper and pencil math tests. And then I want to see how they answer functional word problems. That's my way of looking at mechanics and application in all these areas. And that's what really is involved in an evaluation of learning disabilities. I'm looking for differences in their ability to perform on either the mechanical tests or the applied tests compared to their intellectual capacity. I'm looking at, are they performing given instruction that most other kids in their grade are receiving? Are they performing below grade level or below their age level? And I'm also looking at, are there certain patterns that I see in a child's performance that are indicative of certain types of disabilities? For example, in reading disorder, we see children who struggle with sounding out words. It's actually a precursor to the ability to read or decode words. So when we look at, when they're first learning to identify the sounds in words and compare them to the pictures of words or the symbols, they struggle to learn and pick up that information very effectively. They might have also shown some problems with rhyming or shown some problems with the ability to play with and manipulate sounds in words. And so those kids show a pattern of phonological weakness or poor awareness of phonology that actually then leads them to have some problems with early reading. So I might not necessarily see, or they might be very young for me to see, very significant weaknesses in their ability to read individual words. But if I know that they're struggling with phonology, I have a good sense that they might be headed for or might be having some reading problems. I also look for all kids with learning disabilities tend to have a problem with retrieval of information. This is what parents talk about when they say, it's strange, I sit down and read with my child. They see the word was on the page, and then they read it correctly. And then they see the word right after that on the next sentence, and they read it wrong. And then two sentences later, they read it right again. And it doesn't make sense. It's true. It doesn't make sense. But it's what is a problem with retrieval. Information goes into people's minds, and kids master the information as best they can. But sometimes when they're trying to get it out or get it out very quickly, there's a little glitch in that process. And so they end up struggling with retrieval of information. So it's those patterns that sometimes I'm looking at to make a diagnosis of a learning disability.
Dr.
Some
Cruger?
kids might come to me because they had problems with attentional control. And so they might be showing underperformance in some aspects of their academic knowledge in class. But if an evaluator suspects that it's because of an attention problem, then we do want to understand that. The point you made in the question was a very meaningful one, which is ADHD is a clinical diagnosis. So we make it based on the fact that parents and teachers or other people notice that a child is struggling with attentional control or hyperactive and impulsive behaviors much more than other kids their age. So we're basing it on the observations of people and probably good clinical astuteness that they actually see a child who looks like a child with inattentiveness or hyperactive impulsive behaviors or both. And so it's a diagnosis based on those factors. There are times where I will give tests that help excuse me, add information about a child's attention problems by looking at how well they can apply their attention to standardized tasks. And sometimes that information will add mean value, and sometimes I'm also looking at what I think of as sort of impairment. It sometimes is hard to know how much is attention interfering, and some way to do that is to use tests and measures to gather that information.
If the school says we really think you should go talk to a pediatrician about the attention issues, is it because the school can't diagnose ADHD? Why would they send a parent to an outside professional?
Right, that's true. Most often, a school district is trying to help identify kids who have learning needs. And what I see them doing with their evaluations is not making a diagnosis. They're most often trying to say, is the child eligible for specialized services? So they might classify a child into a category, which might be saying, this category of struggles that he has on the test that he was given looks like a learning disability. And so we're going to say the classification is learning disability, and yet in a way they haven't given a formal diagnosis. They've said the child qualifies for services that are going to allow them to get special education support. ADHD is more complicated than that, and the district is not going to make a diagnosis when they have seen a child who has ADHD. They want to make sure that you're going to a medical professional who can make the diagnosis before any treatment is provided. The kinds of intervention that might help a child with ADHD also are different. So we're not necessarily thinking we're going to provide a child with ADHD more academic-related services. They tend to involve helping a child manage the symptoms of ADHD in a classroom. So we might ask the teachers to modify and adjust the way they give instruction. We might think about some places where a child with ADHD could get more teacher attention or more staff support. But there are other potential things that will be recommended, including medicine to a family. And that's really, I think, a family's decision to make with a medical professional.
Got it. We have a question that's very specific to testing, which is how much weight do you give the individual test scores versus parent or teacher questionnaires?
I think they are all points of data and information. So that, I think, it's a worthy question because if I don't hear a parent describing concerns in reading, it's a little bit hard for me to think that my test scores might demonstrate something that they haven't seen at all. Yet it's true that most parents go into having children because they want to have kids, not because they want to produce great readers. And so they might not have spent as much time studying the experience of reading or learning to read as a professional has. Though that said, the test scores there's two great values that the test scores add that are, I think, important to highlight. The first is control. So the point there being, when you ask any individual to answer a question, or let's say if you ask 10 people to answer a question about something that they saw, everybody sees something slightly differently. We all have our sort of own inherent biases about how we view things. My wife tends to worry a little bit more than I tend to worry. So if we're talking about an academic performance in one of our children, maybe she highlights something that she's more concerned about than I am, or there might be things I'm worried about that she's not. So we have our viewpoints that can vary. But tests try to take that out of the equation by saying, I'm going to give to 1,000 children one specific set of reading questions, and I'm going to see how they perform. And that's what the test developers did. They basically gave the test in the form that they were given to many, many children to see how the best performers perform and how the least successful performers perform. And then we as evaluators use those tests to measure child's performance. So we have this extra level of precision, lots of statistical analysis that have gone into the tests. We sort of use a lot of good background knowledge. Like we know what are the kind of words that most first graders are supposed to be able to read, or what are the math skills that most first graders are supposed to have. So we're also comparing the results against that background information, which makes the tests controlled and in that case reliable, meaning I can take from this test performance that a child who reads these questions and they perform at this level will be very similar to another child of this same age who performs at that same level. They may have made a mistake on one or two items, but it's probably the same one or two items that the other child made. So control is one important thing. The other thing that's really important is it's sort of very hard to fake good or fake bad on these tests. So when I see a score that is a high score, I know that means a lot about how a child performs. Even if it's an average score, it means I know that the child has those abilities. They could not have performed as well as they did if they don't have skills that allow them to do that. And it's very hard for people to perform very poorly by effort or by trying. It's sort of sometimes easy to detect. There's some concerns that not every student is putting in their best effort. Most younger kids always do, but there might be other reasons why a person's struggled. But in a clinical testing situation, it's often easy to detect if someone's sort of not trying very hard or not trying their best. So, and I don't base any diagnosis on one test score either. So I try to use a number of different tests of a number of different kinds of skills that are overlapping and related. And so if I see that a child is performing poorly on one test, they're probably actually performing poorly on a few tests. And so the one test in and of itself isn't always diagnostic.
How can evaluators explain to parents the types of tests that are given, why those tests are given, how to understand the results, and then how to explain it to teachers and others who might need to understand what the child is struggling with?
So I think the first thing is how to evaluators explain the test. I think it's very important that when we do feedback with families, I'm covering many hours of testing, but I typically set up enough time that I can answer the questions that the family has. I pick and choose my tests to highlight things, and I try to use common language to explain the tests. Sometimes that might involve me showing the parents some of the materials that I use, but most of these tests are easy to explain. This is what I asked the child to do, and this is how they performed. What gets more challenging is to explain to a parent, not for reading tests, that sort of makes sense, but for some of the other cognitive measures we give, how we draw an inference about how a child performs on that test to what happens in the real world. So there we have to really use good knowledge of our research and our clinical experiences in the area. The example maybe that I gave before was testing a child's phonology. So if I'm trying to explain to a parent about reading problems and I'm going into phonology, I want them to understand that the link is there in our research and to try to highlight for them why those skill sets are sort of foundational skill sets for reading. So it's just good clinical training and practice and knowledge in order that helps me make that connection for parents. There are other tests that are even harder to make that connection to the real world life experiences that are being assessed when we look at a particular test in the office. But I try to be as thorough and clear in my use of language to explain that. And I want parents to ask me questions. So I'm not delivering the feedback and saying, okay, see you later. I want to know that they understood what I said. I need to have good outcomes from the work that I did. I want the child to get services if they need it. And if the parents don't fully understand, then I want to clarify that. I think, sorry.
No, that's okay. I think you've answered my next question, which is how important is it for parents to keep asking until they have a clear idea of what the testing was about and what it showed?
Yeah, keep asking. Ask for examples. Ask to see the material if you need to. Sometimes a parent could have the sense that they've read, that they can trust the evaluator and understand what the evaluator's talking about. And that's, I think, good to trust their intuitions as well. But I think that many times when I'm trying to talk to a family about the results of the tests, I'm trying to present lots of information in a short amount of time. And even though I go into great detail, sometimes the families leave, many times the families leave, and they have many more questions. So the report that I write is supposed to help with that as well. I want to write a report that captures all the nitty-gritty and all the details of the test that I gave. But I do encourage my families to be able to come back to me and ask me questions. In the context of a school evaluation, I'm not positive always how much access the parents have to the person who did the evaluation or an explanation, and they often have to rely on the written results. So there are times where if you sat down for an IEP meeting, you might want to ask more questions after you've read a report because you just need to understand more. And I think that's a good thing for parents to do.
How do parents go about finding a psychologist who can do a private evaluation as opposed to doing it at the school? Like, what should they be looking for in the person's credentials, or how do you choose and how do you find a specialist?
It's a fantastic question. Probably one of the best ways that I think parents who are coming for a private evaluation find out about good evaluators is through talking to other parents. So if someone else has gone through the experience and they trust an evaluator, that's a meaningful sign. That's one of the ways that families come to me, because someone else has told them that they had a good experience with me and that their child felt comfortable after having done all the tests, and that they felt that there was thoroughness and thoughtfulness in how the evaluation was done. There are centers like Child Mind Institute that has, I have 7 neuropsychologists who work for me. So we always take families that come here when we can help answer their questions. And we, as an institute, expect that we're going to have the best clinicians working in our team. There are other institutions like that, but there are a lot of private evaluators who are saying that they can give and do tests who have had less training. So I think any evaluator that you don't have some word of mouth recommendation on requires making sure that this is something that the person has been doing for some time. So and that they've had a fine level of training. If you're looking for a neuropsychologist, there are several credentialing bodies that approve of certain neuropsychologists. And so they have ways to search for those evaluators, which help you feel more confident that a peer group has said that these people are highly qualified for the job that they're doing. The things that you do need to have when you're looking for a psychologist is someone who it's in the scope of their practice. Not every therapist does evaluations. In fact, it tends to be the case that most people sort of skew one way or the other. They do testing or they do therapy treatment, largely. And so sometimes we want to make sure that the person's had the experience that would help them be credible. Even though they're a great therapist, they might not be a very strong evaluator. And so I guess asking the clinician, are you good at this? Is this something that you've done a lot? Sometimes clinicians will give out examples of reports that they've written before that are de-identified so that a family could sort of know what they are going to get from the process. And then making sure you know what's the experience that the child is going to have. So, if an evaluator said that they were planning to do the tests all day, that would make me wonder if that's the best choice for my 5-year-old.
We've run out of time, unfortunately, so we're going to have to wrap it up. This has been fantastic, though. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you for having me.
I just want to follow up on the whole issue of how to find a professional. Our community is a great place to ask that question, because you can talk to parents who are in your community. So you might want to check out and get some advice from other parents at u.org/community. I also want to remind everybody again that we have a great video of Dr. Cruger performing a reading evaluation, and you can find that at u.org/dyslexia evaluation. And everybody, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.